Hello?
Yeah, Uma.
Yeah, I don't know, my microphone unmute.
Okay,
Several time
next.
ago. Yeah. So yeah, and also many people from Wageningen, the Netherlands also. And from your name, I think you are also from the Netherlands, Dr. Elske. Is that correct?
That's
Are you
right.
Dutch?
That's right. I did my PhD in Wageningen. That's right.
Ah, okay. Yeah, because your name is Judge, but you are working in Australia. Yeah, and I also, yeah, I think your name is familiar to me because I think I cited you in my publication as well. So yeah, I'm very happy that I can meet you now. So yeah, that's uh, our program, and I think I will not be long, and I hope you and students will have a good time together during the course, and probably later. I do not know if you also will, if we also have a like a meeting for the discussion for a possibility of collaboration, maybe. But we'll see. Maybe we will see again. Uh, I don't know in this week or other week. So that's from me. And again, thank you very much. And that's all. Yeah. And wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, thank you for Miss Uma for the welcome speech. Now we move to Mr. Handono. Maybe there is something that you want to say to our guest lecturer today.
Okay, Mbak Laili, thank you very much. And special for Ibu Elske, thank you very much. You can join and sharing with our in the lab Sosiologi Pertanian dan Pemberdayaan Masyarakat in Socio-Economic Department, Agriculture Faculty, University of Brawijaya. This discussion, I hope can student specific student the study program and the course of agriculture sociology. Jadi peserta yang ada di sini mayoritas adalah mahasiswa sosiologi pertanian. Ibu Elske ini mahir dalam bahasa Indonesia, jadi and good fluent in English and other language. Harapannya dengan diskusi yang menarik ini, Ibu Elske itu bisa menceritakan atau memberi sharing atau pengalaman berkenaan dengan kehidupan masyarakat atau sosial ekonomi baik di Indonesia ataupun di pengalaman di luar negeri lainnya. And I hope student can enjoy for material or discuss from Ibu Elske. And I think enough. Thank you, Bu Uma, Bu Elske, Mbak Laili, and others. Thank you very much. Akhirul kalam. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you for Mr. Handono.
Okay.
Permisi.
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
Uma.
Dr. Aska, I also have to teach, so I need to leave earlier. And
Okay.
Nice to see you again, and bye-bye.
Baik, makasih Bu Uma.
Sama-sama, Pak.
Terima kasih.
Thank you, Boma.
Okay, thank you for Mr. Handono and Miss Uma. And now, without any further ado, we will turn the time over to please welcome our guest lecturer, Elske van de Vliet, PhD. The time is all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Mbak Laili and Pak Handono. Siang atau sore? Di sini sudah sore.
Oh, sini siang, Ibu.
Sini siang.
So I understand you're the international program. That's right. The students doing the international program. That's right. So should we use international languages or Everyone would like to hear this in English or in Bahasa Indonesia, Bahasa Belanda, Bahasa Jawa.
English. English.
Yeah, with English. Yeah, we can
Okay.
always listen. There will be maybe a little bit of gado-gado, but the presentation
Okay.
is in English anyway. Before I start, I'd like to just ask quickly, what you are studying. Most of you, what kind of fields or specializations are you doing? So I can pitch it a little bit to what your studies are and interests are. Does anyone want to give an overview, or some of you want to speak?
Okay, so you want the student give the answer, or I can give the answer?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so this is the class of agriculture sociology, and most of the student is at the 3rd semester for now, and they are already learn about some topics regarding the sociology of agriculture. There are several topics that they already learned. The first is there is a community, social community. There is a social interaction and social process. And the third one, there is a social group and social organization. And there is a social stratification too.
Okay.
And of course, there is a topic about social change. So I think that's
Great,
the
thank you.
topic.
Yeah, so it's not a course, it's a whole program on sociology. So I'm asking because I'd like to know, I wanted to know whether you really come from a social science kind of mindset, and that looks like it, you've all the courses you've done, or more agriculture. So it's actually very interesting that you have that more sociology program in a faculty of agriculture. Before I start a presentation, just a little bit where I came from. So I started out in the Netherlands as a biology student. I got interested in ecology and the application of ecological principles in agriculture and rural development, and worked on biological pest management. And then for my master's, I wanted to go overseas. I'd always wanted to work overseas, and ended up in a project of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations Sri Lanka, which was about integrated pest management, but they wanted to have somebody who would do agricultural extension. And so I took some courses in Wageningen and thought, I can do this. I like the humans. And that's how I eventually ended up in what we first called communication and innovation. So the agriculture extension, so penyuluhan pertanian, was changed to communicasi dan inovasi. And then I worked actually in Indonesia. I probably worked longest in my life in Indonesia rather than anywhere else. So,
Sorry, Bu Elske, your microphone
Sorry, yeah, I know. I just realized,
okay.
Yeah, I put it on mute. Sorry, so I just start quickly. Did you hear the first part? Because it was not on mute earlier. I'm not sure where it went on mute. It seems to go on mute by itself, or somebody clicking a button. But anyway, so I'll very briefly capture that. So I started out as a biologist and working then in agriculture, ecology, biological pest management. But then in the field, while working for my master's research and later PhD, it was really about agricultural extension, penyuluhan pertanian, which then was started to be named communication and innovation, communicatie en innovatie, instead of penyuluhan, which had this connotation of being top down, and worked in the field for a long time. And I came then 14 years ago to UQ, where I was asked to actually then teach communication for social change. So that's and I'll explain in my lecture how that transition actually has worked in the field of rural development, from more focus on innovation to more like sustainability, and then to social change. So I will share my presentation with you, and we'll get into it. You can see, can somebody confirm that you can see the presentation?
Okay, I see your PPT.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So, So the title, because you are studying rural sociology and empowerment, I thought it would be good at looking at community empowerment for sustainable rural development, and then particularly what the role is of communication or communication for social change, because I think it is vital. It's very important to get that both sustainability as well as empowerment going on the ground. So I will first talk a little bit about what development is, what sustainable development is, and social change, so that we have a common understanding how we talk about these things. Then about rural community empowerment, and eventually wrap up with what role communication plays in this. So before I go there, I want to have some observations of, I first came to Indonesia probably before many of the students were born. It was in December 1988. And there was still, and I was in Yogyakarta, and there was still a lot of becaks and, bicycles. And that, of course, over the years, if we look now, that has changed. There's now more motorbikes, taxis, cars, and of course, the consequences of that. Macet, right? There is now, life has changed a lot because of that, what we call often progress, economic progress. And when I came in the 1980s, 1990s, there was still a lot of dependency on aid programs in Indonesia. There was a lot of aid money coming in from governments, from the World Bank, from IMF and others. And that has changed over the last 10 years, more aid for trade. So it is more about the trade relations and in supporting more developing countries to actually be stronger in the trade agreements. Cross-country or regional trade agreements and regional and global alliances. Of course, we've seen that education got much better. You guys are all now doing an international program. That was not available when I first moved to Indonesia. That's why I had to learn Indonesian. Nobody would speak English. And more people finished school, and the literacy levels really went up. But we also see on the other side, the flip side, that few people want to be farmers, and there's a lot of urbanization. So in the end, who is going to grow the food for all the people in the cities? And we see also that people are getting taller, because of better nutrition. But then we also see that there's a lot of junk food coming in through local fast food, and there's more diet-related health problems like diabetes or obesity. That is all. We see that all coming in, both in developed as well as developed countries. That's the impact. But then we also see I particularly since I'm in Australia, I've still worked a lot in Indonesia, particularly in the east, in NTT, NTB. And we see that some areas haven't really changed a lot or hardly anything over the past 30 years. There's still a lot of people in remote areas who go hungry whenever they've run out of their harvest, and they don't harvest a lot. There's still people who have nothing to lose and go demonstrate for whoever, for $3 a day, because it doesn't matter what the ideology is, they just need the money. Now there's a lot of reinventing the wheel in development, people starting to do things that we did 30 years ago, and because these processes haven't been reviewed well. And we also can see that development initiatives are, increasingly a mismatch for those people who I put here, missed the bandwagon, who fell between the cracks, who are staying in the margins, and all the new methodologies and programs really are too advanced for them to pick up. So, and I would like to talk you through, how that has happened and what we can still do about it. So when we talk about development, sustainable development and social change, there is, a lot of good things, there's some bad things, but there's also a lot of hope still, despite all the global problems we are looking at. If we look at the GDP per capita, we see that it has really increased. Now, if you look the big bubble, Indonesia here in the middle, you see there's very few people now who are below the international poverty line. But of a few people, it's a small percentage, but of course it's still a lot of people because of the large population of Indonesia. But this is so much better here in 2018 than it was 10 or 20 years ago. But we also know, and this was published in the ASEAN Post in 2018, that the 4 richest people in Indonesia have more wealth than the poorest 100 million people. Now that's a lot of people, who share only that much wealth or money as 4 people have, 4 very rich people. We know also that the top 1% richest people in Indonesia own 50% of the country's wealth. So, and that's not typical for Indonesia, that in the US, it's almost the same in many other countries. That's the case as well. So you don't have to feel bad about it, but we have to, think about it. And particularly because there's so many people in Indonesia, the 99% who only have 50%, the other 50% of the wealth, it's a lot of people. That is like, over 200 million people. So do we want a future like that, where more and more people get poor and a few get richer? So we have to kind of consider that, how we want to contribute to development, to make sure that everyone can actually at least have a good living. Not everyone has to have the same, but we need to be concerned about those who have little. So what is development? So in Indonesian, there's actually 3 words that are translated in English into development. And so you all know that, of course, pembangunan, pengembangan, and perkembangan mean different things. And particularly, of course, pembangunan, the base word is bangun. So it's about the construction of the economy and of the country, whereas pengembangan and perkembangan are more about either individual development, perkembangan, and pengembangan is development of something or of capacity of people. And it's important to realize that there's different words and that we know about how we talk about it differently. For instance, when we talk about research supporting development, in English it all sounds the same, but in Indonesia it's actually different. R&D, which was the concept that was used a lot in the modernization area, is penelitian dan pengembangan. It's developing those technologies to, from research to go out. Whereas nowadays we talk a lot about R4D, research for development, and it's actually penelitian untuk pembangunan, and to support the society and the economy, and particularly those who are not so well off. So it indicates that development is change, and change for the better, of course. But then we have to kind of consider, what do we consider better? What does it mean? Yeah, if you look at this evolution of the human species from, the prehistoric humans when they started walking on 2 legs to now we see there's a lot of health problems and people become what we call in English couch potatoes. Huh? I don't know how that's translated in Indonesian, but, and people are not necessarily healthy, because they have more. So what is being better? Is it being wealthier, having more money or more land or more stuff? Do we really need all of that? Or is it also about being healthier and live longer? Is it about being more secure, have less risk? And particularly for poor people, that's very important, because they can't afford to have risk. If you have a lot, you can afford some risk. Or is it having peace of mind, having peace or peace of mind? Of course, in areas where there is no peace, where there are wars or conflict, people, their first priority is peace. Whereas I always remember a farmer in Central Java that I met who said, well, I don't really have to, to chase money all the time. What is important is peace of mind, that I can feed my children, can send them to school, but also I have, peace of mind. You have to, and it's a cultural thing, and it is a personal thing as well. And then we have to consider also how change in one area impacts on another aspect of life, because you may improve in one area, for instance, have more money, but if that then results into behaviors that affect your health, then of course you're not necessarily have changed for the better. And also, how does change for one group impact other groups? How do some, for instance, of course, for people who are already a little bit rich, they can get richer, but often at the cost of poorer, or people who start using forests and breaking them down, they actually take away opportunities for people who live from the forest. So there's always a flip side to that. So we have to think about that development is a change for the better, and as much as possible for all. I think this is a picture of Jakarta, where we know that it shows a lot of, developed high-rise buildings, a lot of economic activity going on, but there's also a lot of air pollution that affects the health of people, and there are a lot of slums where people, just hardly can come by and live in very kind of difficult situations. So it's not just change, but a change of well-being. And it's a better term than just looking at wealth only or welfare. You know, it's about really, we have to be well in a holistic way. And that is about having options, how to make better decisions, what is good for you, or what works well. And of course, if there are options, you need to have access to those options. So that's part of development too. And then a very important part is power, having power. And power is not always kekuasaan, yeah, that you can decide what, you know, what applies to everyone, but it is very much that power in being empowered, pemberdayaan, and that's different. It is about that you can decide on the direction of change in a way that suits you. And different people have different aspirations, have different opportunities. So, and that's how we often look at a more balanced form of development where people can become empowered and give the change process, give direction to the change process in a way that suits them. But that implies a lot because it's not easy to program. So, and we see that particularly when development was just starting off, like the Orde Baru, it was really a very rapid kind of development phase in Indonesia, was inspired by what happened in Europe with the support of the United States after the Second World War. And it was all about, you know, transfer of technology, modernization, becoming modern, coming out of traditional societies with science and technology and becoming a more modern society. I said focus on science and technology, but it was all about economic growth. That became the dominant way of thinking about development. You know, there always had to be growth in national economies. And that implied at the time, you know, science was provided by research institutes, universities. So it was planned in a top-down way and implemented, and people were just told what to do. And then the economic indicators were really, were used for measuring impact, mainly by income and growth. But we also know that the flip side of that was that, you know, became environmental degradation, you know, forest was chopped down, a lot of air pollution, a lot of, you know, waterways got polluted because of indiscriminate kind of economic growth. Food safety issues with pesticides and other things, health problems, loss of culture, indigenous knowledge and traditions, social inequality, the richer got richer and the poorer got, the gap with the poor got bigger, and also conflicting interests between groups who use the same resources. So it was really realized in the late 1980s, early 1990s, that, you know, we had to be more sustainable in the development, not just chase that economic growth, but, and I'm sure you've learned all this already in your courses, so that we had to think about how do we develop, but in a way that we don't compromise, you know, the ability to meet the needs by the future generations. And then the dimensions became not only economic, but had to be economic, not 100% profitable, but viable, you know, so growth, but not necessarily maximum, because you had to balance with social justice, with keadilan, with environmental protection, and also the political commitment. So those dimensions became very important for a different paradigm of development that, you know, that emphasizes sustainability. So you're probably familiar with this sustainable livelihood frameworks, sustainable livelihood framework, where these different capitals are emphasized, and it reflects on what I said just now: financial or economic, the natural or the environment, the human capital, people, how they make their decisions, how they are capable of doing things differently, the social capital and the relations and the leadership, and the physical capital or the infrastructure, in an area that's supported. So then livelihood outcomes are not only economical. Yes, you would still need more income in a society where economic growth is important and inflation exists, but it is also about increased well-being, reduced vulnerability, improved food security, and the sustainable use of the natural resource base. And of course, you're probably all familiar with this as well, the Sustainable Development Goals. We first had the Millennium Development Goals that were fewer goals and mainly apply to developing countries, many targets not reached by 2015. So then the United Nations and all the members said we need a much stronger global target. So the Sustainable Development Goals from 2016 to 2030 became the agenda for the whole world, all countries, whether they're developing and the global south or whether they are already more advanced, or more not advanced necessarily, but what is called the more developed goals. It applies to everyone because this is about ending extreme poverty all over the world. You know, you may not believe it, but there's a lot of poverty in Australia as well. You know, that's particularly with the less advantaged groups like indigenous communities, migrant communities, and even some of the people who've been here for generations, from the English migrants who came here a long time ago. And so the poverty exists everywhere. Fight inequality and injustice, which is definitely a global problem, and fix climate change is now going to be extremely important because it relates to all the other major problems as well, because things are getting only worse because of the climate change and the dangers that people are exposed to. And so there's now these 17 goals, 169 targets that apply all over the world. Very briefly, I want to touch on some trends that you probably heard a bit about, but I want to put this in context because it does influence the way a lot of programs, kind of development programs are being run at the moment. And it is the importance of neoliberalism that came really in over the past, became, a set of economic policies over the past, say, 10, 15 years, particularly aiming for a market-driven approach to economic development. And that had implications for the private, and that's when all those trade agreements started to be made. But that had implications for privatization of a lot of earlier government organizations. You see, for instance, agriculture extension. In Indonesia, we still have the system penyuluhan, but it's very badly resourced. And many other countries, the penyuluhan just went to private companies. Free trade, open markets, and deregulation. So the government was no longer really holding a strong hand on those developments, but the private sector, and the government is more facilitating that. And therefore had reduced spending because they were just enhancing the role of the private sector. And the government really became a promoter of markets and competition rather than a provider of public welfare. So you can say, yes, if you look at, so that goes together with sustainable development. And I still think it is partly conflicting, but it both exists in the way programs are designed at the moment. A bit of the modernization is still there. Now with the sustainable development goals, there's a lot about the sustainable development, but then also neoliberalism is very strongly influencing policies. And we have to recognize that, that we work in that global climate. So there's the consequence for communication for development services is that they are very often commercial and digital because they have to go across borders of countries and to work in partnerships. The second trend is, of course, that we live now in a digital age, and you guys know that all really well. Everyone uses digital tools all the time. It's also called information age or the internet age. And it is that the world economy is now based on information and communication technology. So we've seen a transition from the analog kind of media and informing people or even having exchanges, like face-to-face, print, radio, TV, to those internet or satellite based TV, mobile phones, all the digital platforms, which again has implications because who decides, who owns those systems and who decides how the information being filtered, because there's so much. And if you've read a little bit about algorithms, you know that it is our behaviors on using the internet is hugely determined by how the algorithms are steering us towards certain pieces of information. So again, something just to be aware of a trend when we work in this space. And the consequence, of course, is that everything becomes digital, it's only the people who can afford to have a good smartphone or a computer, who can keep up. And those who don't, they fall between the cracks. So you get what we call the digital divide. And people, again, those who can't afford, they get further and further left behind. And that's where then what we often call another development is a really interesting book by Wendy Quarry and Ricardo Ramirez, where we look at sustainability at the same time as equity and empowerment of citizen and the recognition of culture. We had to be able to come to more balanced societies, which requires a more holistic approach, that we really have to be serious about integrating those different elements, which we already started to do in sustainable development, but gets diluted very often with the economic agenda. We need education. People need to be able to educate it to get actively involved, and that I'll talk a bit more about when we talk about empowerment, because it is very important in empowerment that you understand things and can make better decisions. And participation, of course, is a big component of that. Participation, not just in name only, which often happens, but participation in setting the agendas, participation in planning programs and activities, participation, implementation, and evaluation, and to determine. And in this picture, you see some farmers that we worked with in Vietnam, could have been easily in Indonesia as well. And these were farmers from an ethnic minority area in the mountains. And we really wanted to have a participatory project, to have them involved, but they were so not used to being asked for their opinions that it took us 2 years before actually I could make a picture like this, where a farmer actually says, well, no, I don't agree with you, with the researchers, because what's happening in my field is that, and they were so subdued, so malu almost to speak out, because they were never listened at. And so it's something that needs to change all society. You can't just do a project that is in name participatory. The society has to allow that participation and people to actually have a voice and be listened at and be followed up on. So, and that takes often time. So, and then how does social change comes in? So perubahan sosial, so is often now used in a lot of context, but not always in the right context. Very often it is just considered, as I put here at the bottom, just any social process, or just mainly behavior, economic change. The way we work with it here in our department is that actually social change is about a change in the power dynamics. It is about challenging those power dynamics to allow that empowerment of people to speak out and do things the way that is best for them. And that can be changes in social institutions or in behaviors, and it has to be in relations. You'd have to negotiate those dynamics. And so, as I said, it is about empowerment, and it is about equity to achieve equality. And if you look, I don't know whether any of you have ever seen this picture, but it really gives a nice indication of what a difference between equality and equity is. In Indonesian, equality we can translate with persamaan, everyone gets the same, right? And you see here, it sounds fair, right? It's fair if everyone gets the same. Well, depends. You see here, in this case, if they want to look over a fence at a sports game and you give everyone the same height, of course, this little guy here can't see anything. So equity is about giving people what they need to achieve the same level. So you see here, for them to all be able to peep over the fence, they need different levels of support. But in reality, we know that very often those who already have a lot and are in better capacity, they can accumulate more. And they, and the guys who have little, they get, further dug in, and they fall, more and more, behind the cracks. So the social change is about really encouraging equity to eventually, achieve more, that everyone is in a fairly, total equality, total equity will never be there. Everyone will never all exactly be the same. but at least, people can be provided more opportunities if they need it. So that's what we're trying to do with, in this whole field of communication for social change and participatory communication. So let's talk a bit about then what it means in terms of empowerment of rural communities, because it is an underlying element into achieving equity. It is about making the decisions that are best for you. And every individual is different. People, as I said, the farmer I met in Central Java just wanted to have, enough to eat and send the kids to school, but also have peace of mind. Whereas like when I worked in Vietnam, there was never a single farmer who wanted to make as much money as they could, so they were chasing the money. So, and it's a personal choice. It's a little bit culture as well. So what is empowerment then? This picture actually comes from business. So in leadership, in businesses, they talk a lot about empowerment, because if your workers are empowered, they often work better and more efficient. So it has a lot of elements of having a bit of power, at least over the things you have to do, so that you can, put your heart and soul in it and do the best you can, have access to whatever the support you need, the options, positive thinking, learning, growth, self-image, morals. Often empowerment is defined as, so it's a process. Becoming empowered, being empowered is the final state, but empowerment is the process towards what we call autonomy, having being able to make autonomous decisions. Auto means self as well, and self-determination, and being able to be determined yourself what you need and what is good for you. And it can be in individuals, it can also be existing in communities or in groups. So what does it take then to be empowered? I think there are two major areas. First is what we call agency, and it's not like a company or anything. Agency here is about capacity. And abilities and characteristics. So the agency of people or groups that could include attitude, and attitude is often underpinned by, by cultural values or things like that. It is about knowledge and skills, and particularly critical skills. I'll talk about it in a second. Critical skills, keterampilan, it can be more keterampilan praktis, knowing how to do things, but keterampilan more analytisch, being able to do an analysis of your options and of an economic analysis, whether something is going to be good for you. That's what we call critical skills, figuring things out, what is best for you. Doing a small experiment or calculations or test it out. It is also by the ability to make informed decisions, because you have been able to work it out. So you need to know things, work it out, and then make a good decision. Ability to act, do things based on the opportunities you have and your decisions you made. The ability to express your views, your needs, your aspirations, and being able to speak out. And be able to stand up for your rights. So, but before you can stand up for your rights, you have to know your rights. And very often, many governments don't actually communicate people's rights very well. They communicate the law and the regulations and the obligations, but not so much the rights. What hak, what rights you have. For instance, I have one student here doing her PhD. She's from Kenya in East Africa, and she looks at women empowerment, and particularly from that, how community radio can influence it. But the constitution, the local laws, since the last 10 years or so, are very much into the rights of women, to have the same rights and get jobs, the same, not being abused by husbands or by whoever. That kind of thing. But in practice, it's not working. Because first of all, women don't know their rights. If they do know, they go to the police. The police just, basically ignores it, because they have that power to maintain the status quo. Anyway, so, and it is then eventually part of agency is ownership over the change process, and being able to own something, that you don't change because somebody tells you, but because you really feel that is the best for you. And then, of course, opportunities are important. It's the availability of goods and services that you need. So they should be available and there should be access to. So you could have, and there's two different words, availability and access are two different words. For instance, you could have power lines go over your house, but your house is not connected to the electricity. And so there's availability of electricity, but you don't have access to it. And maybe because you couldn't afford a connection. And so you'd have to look at both these levels. Socio-cultural context that should be supporting if they're very traditional kind of, for instance, for women, not to be able to speak out in a certain society. How do you break through that before they can? And having the channels to be heard, can you actually go and say your things, or will you rather be punished, for instance, going to the police, or can you go to the radio station, or can you write a letter to somebody, or is there a suggestion box? So you need those channels to actually be able to express yourself. So, and we see that very often rural communities are, that are marginalized, are restricted in their opportunities to become empowered, because they have often limited access to goods and services, limited opportunities for that personal development, limited ways to be heard, and often people are in a vicious circle of subsistence and small-scale livelihoods, like, gali lubang tutup lubang, that kind of, thing. And you don't get out of it, very easily. And then, of course, also the power dynamics, quite often in remote or kind of in marginalized areas. There's those who have more power and those have little power. They can't really come out of that. And it could be cultural, or it could be because of economic distributions. Those with a lot of economic wealth can maintain the power and won't give anything away. So that it's extra hard, but also extra important to look at those marginalized rural communities if you think empowerment is important then. And then, of course, there's the dimension of gender, age, and disability that also influence, possibilities for empowerment. As I said, in many societies, women just have fewer chances to become empowered, or young people as opposed to older people or people with disability. So there's another level of dimension there, an extra layer of marginalization. Okay, then how does communication come in? And communication is all about, actually, it's not just about sending messages. Having a typical communication is a sender, receiver, and a channel, but that's not only communication. Communication is about, also about exchange and dialogue and facilitation, because we need language and we need, gestures, and we need things to get people to involve in a change process. And particularly then, if we talk about communication for development and social change, is how do we facilitate change for the better, like how we defined it, and for all, not only for the richest. So we have to, if we go back to that monetization paradigm of development, a typical communication model was, because it was science and technology, it was the core, it was very technology centered. So the communication model was transfer of technology, and the World Bank called it development communication, and typically in Indonesia it was komunikasi pembangunan, and it was also part of the Orde Baru kind of traditions in Indonesia. And it's about diffusion and adoptions and different level, but very top down. And we see that people who fell between the cracks because they didn't adopt that technology, they were called laggards, kok terbelakang itu kok nggak ikut itu, padahal maybe they had very good reason why they could not actually, or maybe the whole technology wasn't relevant for them. So that changed a bit with the sustainable development and the participatory approaches coming in as of the 1990s, and more bottom-up processes, and where people are engaged, or, all stakeholders, to assess the situation and these opportunities and decide together what is the best change for them, for their community, or for their families, or for themselves. And so it is the involvement of all stakeholders in both planning, implementation, evaluation, not only the implementation, or sometimes only the kind of the assessment, but not really in the planning. The consultants come in, talk to people, kind of, they think it's a participatory process, but they take the information away and they design the project. That's actually not fully participatory. It's only consultative. So communication is then seen as a process of facilitation, facilitating people to really become aware of the situation, to identify the options and the solutions that work for them, and together work something out that is going to benefit at least many. It is providing access still to the information, innovation, and learning opportunities, because that is needed to support that empowerment process. So there's many aspects to then communication and many aspects to designing communication strategies that really support that more kind of empowering form of development and social change. So if you look then in Indonesia, I've already said this, so in the Orde Baru system, there was the Komunikasi Pembangunan, whereas in the Reformasi period, you know, the whole approaches of what I have seen is really gado-gado. It is, you know, very often different practices. You know, a consultant comes in and brings some practices and it's being done, but the underlying principles are actually not fully adopted. And we see that it's also quite difficult because the system isn't really changed. The system is still quite hierarchical and top down. You know, that's just the way it is, and that isn't really changing a lot. But we have started to talk about komunikasi untuk pembangunan, so not just komunikasi pembangunan, which is the DEFCON, and in English we call it a communication for development and social change, a komunikasi untuk pembangunan dan perubahan sosial. But then we see the rise and fall of all these approaches, partly because very often, and it relates to what I said here, very often things are practiced in a one-size-fits-all kind of way, but they don't necessarily fit. If you're really true to participatory nature, you have to adapt it to that local condition together with the stakeholders, and internalize it, have people have ownership over it, because everything is, you know, a lot of things are done in Indonesia through projects, you know, and often it's just 1 year funding, and then, you know, dananya datang terlambat, tinggal 9 bulan, ya seperti itu kan. So that is, you know, that's not how you get sustainable development. You really have to work with people to internalize and own those change processes. So, and if we look at a very good definition of communication for development, if we first look at development, how they define that is to help people toward their own full awareness of the situation and the options, to resolve conflict, to work towards consensus, to help people to plan actions for change, and help people acquire the knowledge and skills they need and improve the effect. This is all empowerment. So then communication for empowerment is really using the use of communication processes, techniques, and media to support these processes of empowerment. And of course, with support of proper information about new options and new knowledge, but it is also about that enabling people's ability to make better decisions. And that is a very different process than just persuasive communication and sending messages out or organizing a training, you know, where people get long lectures and, you know, just sit and drink tea and then go home and forget about it. It's really about working together, dialogue, and working things out. What works best for everyone, and everyone's situation is different. So what is then the future of communication for development and social change, and particularly in Indonesia? Well, I've really learned over the past 30 years, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Very often we try things out in a project, and then, you know, governments want to scale them up, and it, you know, they want to have this simple model, what we call often silver bullet, peluru perak, you know, the silver bullet solution. But they don't work. If something works very well with farmers in Kupang, they don't necessarily work with farmers in Malang Selatan, you know, because they're different culture, different environmental conditions, different maybe level of education and that kind of thing. So there is no one size fits all, and particularly not if we recognize that need for equity, because we have to see what do people really need. And that's, again, that's different, you know, to be able to achieve a little bit more equality. We also need, there's always that need for face-to-face communication and more adaptable, interactive communication. And it has it has very strong power, actually. It's very powerful because people often, trust is something they hear from somebody they trust much more, or when they formulate it themselves, much more than when they hear it on TV or see it on a poster. And so, and that really, a lot of the more sustainable change requires deep knowledge, requires skills, and particularly critical skills, and that you cannot learn from a YouTube video or from a radio program. It requires dialogue, it requires trial and error, it requires often conflict resolution and power negotiation. So yes, we can use the mass media and the new media. They can be inclusive and also democratizing only if you really design them well. Of course, the advantage of those media is that they can provide a lot of information very fast and wide, but also then we don't know what people do with it. So that's why that interactive process is still very important. And so, because that information mainly raises awareness, but does not build here what we have here, the deep knowledge or the skills, and definitely not the critical skills. That's something that you need, that interpersonal process still for. So that's what I said here. It requires supporting processes for empowerment. So you really need to look at that mix, and there's no one simple solution that can quickly, spread through all the 200 million people plus, in Indonesia. That's just not going to be possible. It's going to be, and of course the institutions will have to support and change as well. So in the end, it is you as graduates, you have to think about what choices are you going to make, how you want to work. If you're going to work for a company or for a government or for a research institute, how do you want to contribute to that development that is going to be a change for the better, but also for all? So I'd like to hear some of you. So I'll leave my presentation with here, and I really hope we can have a bit of a discussion about this further. So thank you. I've got a few references that you can access. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for Ms. Elske. It is really an interesting topic for today. Okay, now I would like to give a time for all of the students. If you have any question, you can ask to Ms. Elske. Any question? Don't be shy. If you can ask in English, you can ask in Bahasa, right, Ms. Elske? Is it okay if they ask in Bahasa?
Nggak masalah. Ya, boleh. Bahasa apa? Bahasa.
In Bahasa
Bahasa
Indonesia.
Jawa, Profesor.
Hai, Ibu Reza baru dapat.
Ya, Bu Reza kangen Profesor katanya.
Okay, for the student, any question?
Excuse me, may I ask?
Okay, Alda, from Felicia. Okay, Felicia, you can.
I'm sorry, ma'am, but I think someone already asking first before me.
Oh, okay. Oh, Alda Rizkino, right? Okay, maybe Felicia first.
Okay, thank you, Miss Laili, and good afternoon, Miss Elske. And I want to ask about, you mentioned earlier that development equals to economic growth, and economic growth cannot be reached by a country if only some of the province who feeling some change, like developing change or something. And I really want to ask you about, like Indonesia has a lot of rural areas and indigenous people who still live in the middle of the forest. And how in your opinion, how is the best approach for them to make them realizing that developing their areas is really important to change the whole economic growth in a country? Thank you.
Can I answer straight away? Because I think that it's connected. It will be good, yeah? So thanks, Felicia. That's a very good question. So, I mean, it is basically how the world kind of works these days. You know, it's about economic growth. The question, what I try to show is that how much economic growth do you want, right? You know, only pushing economic growth without thinking about the environment or about, you know, about the social equity. We've learned that that's not going to actually benefit many people. And you're absolutely right. There's a lot of people in remote areas who will not be able to participate in that kind of change. So and that's what I was trying to say. I mean, it was interesting how you formulated. You says, how can we make those people kind of realize they need to develop their areas? Well, who are we to decide that they need to develop, right? That's what you have to also think about. So what I usually do, for instance, and I took actually a whole group of Australian students to Indonesia last year, when we could still travel, to work in areas of, in peatland areas, daerah gambut, Kalimantan, Sumatra, where there's a lot of fires, a lot of, you know, partly because companies burn the land, but partly also because they have to find a balance between clearing land and growing crops to support the families versus versus restoring the environment. So they are constantly, of course, they want to have better lives. So I don't believe there's any single person how marginalized they are that they don't want to improve their life. It is only that they have to understand, have to see the options that they have that are suitable for them. And what we have seen with a lot of development programs, I've seen it in Indonesia, I've seen it in Vietnam as well. Many programs come in at, okay, maybe you can look at it this way. If people are still in subsistence kind of, you know, their subsistence livelihoods, they just grow crops for the families and they collect some, you know, some things from the forest and they have a few chickens and that kind of thing. So that's kind of SD, right? You know, masih di sekolah SD, or maybe TK. If you come in with a project that right away jumps them to S3, well, that's not possible, you know, and a lot of programs are really sophisticated and they bring in technology. Oh, this will change, you know, we're bringing this great variety and then they have to use fertilizers and pesticides and all that kind of stuff. But those farmers who are still, you know, in subsistence mode, they don't have the money to buy fertilizers or pesticides every season. When they harvest, maybe in most programs then give it once and say, oh, then, you know, they will learn. But then they harvest and then they need that money to pay off their debts, you know, because they're already in that vicious circle of, you know, lingkaran setan, you know, of gali lubang. It doesn't help them really, you know. So what we have done, for instance, in a project in Timor Barat, in Kupang, is really first think of a methodology that you sit around the table with farmers and say, hey, what does your situation look like? And what do you see as opportunities to improve your livelihoods? Because the government would come in with a project, oh, everyone needs to start growing feed for cattle, right? And then fatten the cattle and then they can earn more money. And farmers, we had a meeting, farmers weren't interested. And it took 2 hours talking to them, trying to analyze before they said, yeah, of course it's not interesting for us because kita nggak punya ternak. Ya memang memelihara ternak tapi tidak memiliki sendiri. Kalau saya memelihara ternak untuk orang yang sudah kaya, dia sebenarnya kalau sapinya lebih gemuk, yang dapat lebih banyak duit, yang punya, bukan saya yang memelihara. Kenapa saya harus susah payah itu menanam pakan, kan? So that solution is a good solution for somebody who owns cattle, but not for a farmer who doesn't. So, and a lot of the solution have to be adapted. So what we did is we really sat around the table many times with the farmers and analyzed that mereka hanya bisa keluar dari ketergantungan pada orang yang milik ternak kalau dia akhirnya juga memiliki sendiri. Bagaimana dia bisa memiliki ternak? Dia harus punya duit dulu untuk beli. And how can they get money? The only asset they had was land that they were not using very well. So we worked on a way for them to actually grow, supaya mereka nanam jagung yang lebih bagus, dan lebih banyak daripada yang dibutuhkan, dan sisanya dijual dari penjualan jagung, baru dia bisa beli ternak. Berarti program harus dirancang secara terpadu dengan melihat semua peluangnya, tidak bisa hanya dari situ. So, and what I then did, I designed actually a simulation game so farmers could imagine how many steps it would take for them to turn their livelihoods around, because it's very hard to imagine, if it's, and change the corn cultivation and then buy cattle and then it's very difficult to imagine if you've never done that. So we designed a simulation game and got farmers to play. It's like Monopoly, the game Monopoly. They were playing with play money and everything. And that's when they suddenly said, wow, now my eyes are open now that I actually have opportunities. And then suddenly they wanted to work themselves, and they were no longer asking for bantuan. They were saying, oh, if I can do this, that, and that, I can make that much. And that is exactly what I mean. That's that critical skill development that is needed first before people can really do things better. Oh, that was a long answer. Does that make sense, Felicia?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, good.
Okay,
The next
so
one,
thank you for-
Audina.
Yes. The second question is come from Audina Bil Akmal.
Okay,
Pak Audi.
thank you for Assalamualaikum. Thank you for the opportunity. I want to ask a question. In your lecture, you point out some of our problems, especially in Indonesia. In your opinion, what can we learn from other more advanced and developed countries in terms of how we run things in Indonesia? Thank you.
Ooh. If I can answer that question, I should be president of Indonesia. How's that? Okay, but I will never be. It's a really good question. My question would be, what can you do, rather than what I think I can do? I think the one thing what I have learned, and it's not actually an answer to your question, but every country has its own characteristics, right? And particularly Indonesia is extremely diverse. You've got, so many ethnic groups, you've got so many languages, you've got so many different islands and areas and environmental conditions. So, and that's why I say there is no one size fits all. Now, the problem is, of course, and that really came from the Orde Baru, where to get the big nation together after the colonial times, there had to be some sort of a unified way of doing things, right? But then we see that benefited, particularly some areas much better than others. Of course, you can say, oh, we sent all the hardworking Javanese farmers to, transmigrasi to Kalimantan, and they will turn the land. But the land in Kalimantan is very different. It's not as fertile. So, whatever the transmigrants knew, what worked in Java did not necessarily work in Kalimantan. So they had to learn all over again and do things differently. So what I've learned is what both from theory and what you see in some places, work is, you need to have localized kind of adaptations to programs. The one thing that I said that is really, I think, a barrier to sustained good change in Indonesia is the way, in fact, politics influence the development. Because, I worked with some really good people high up in the government in the Ministry of Agriculture, but then there was an election and a new minister, and the new minister signs new directors, and then the good people get moved and they need to leave the projects behind. And they can't, because what was needed is the change within these institutions and to do things differently. But if somebody who is driving that, a champion who's driving that, gets then just, suddenly put in another job in another department or another center, it's disconnected because the next person will not pick it up. They need to, right? Mereka harus punya nanti telapaknya sendiri. Dia tidak akan melanjutkan dari yang sebelumnya. And so and short-term funding, that 1-year projects, it's not going to make a change in the long run. So it is really more about a sustainable way of thinking about the longer term kind of processes. That would be my recommendation. But it is, I mean, everything in Indonesia is so big, so many people involved. That's why it's so difficult to make those changes. Does that answer your question a bit?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, so you can be the next change maker. Make sure things are done long term. How's that?
Thank you, thank you. Thank you,
Okay.
Mrs.
Okay, thank you for Audi for the question. Maybe Audi have the chance to be the next agriculture ministry, maybe Bu Elske.
Yep.
Okay, for the next question is come from Bagus Joyo Saputro. The time is all yours.
Okay,
Bagus
thank you,
Joyo
Miss.
Saputro. Yes.
Before that, I want to say thank you to Miss Elske in your presentation. It's such an interesting presentation. And I would like to sorry if I can turn on my camera because I have problem with that. And my question is, in slide of another development by Quarry and Ramirez is mentioned that we need to do a cultural recognition.
Yeah.
Do you have any clearer explanation about what is cultural recognition? And
Yeah.
what if the culture of indigenous community destroys the environment? And have you seen any culture that destroyed the environment in Indonesia? And then doesn't it even support the environment degradation as you mentioned before? Thank you.
Okay. Good, very good question, Bagus. So cultural recognition is yeah, well, I mean, what it says it, respect and understand the importance of culture that is there. But I agree, there are cultural aspects that sometimes are damaging to a society as well. For instance, I mean, what I've seen in some ways is, for instance, how women are treated in some cultures. Now we think, that's not fair, right? Whereas, they still think, that's just the way to go about it. In terms of how with environment, very often we actually see that more indigenous or traditional societies, they actually have a close connection with the environment, and they utilize it in sustainable ways. And it's not until actually they start chasing being part of that economic growth kind of thing that actually the environments get damaged, because indigenous knowledge very often knows much better about the balance of the resources and the use of the resources to sustain them. So I don't have an actually clear example how certain traditional cultures have actually totally damaged the environment, because they were so much more dependent on it. Nowadays, you can say, well, we can start exploiting if for instance, the soil becomes less fertile if you exploit it. But then, we have other opportunities. You can become also on the side, your yield goes down, but you can also be a tukang ojek and get some money, on the side. So, there's different opportunities in the current kind of economic climate. So I agree that cultures change. Culture doesn't have to be to stay the same all the time. They have changed already, and they will change over time. But the importance is that it should not be eradicated because of radical changes from above. It should be an organic process, and people who are part of that culture and respect it and need it for their own dynamics in the community, it's up to them to allow that change to happen. So that's more what is implied with the cultural recognition. And I agree, it's not that always traditional practices are better, and particularly not if you can integrate some, but it doesn't always work that way. So and it changes over time. So, but again, there should be a recognition, and only kind of things will change because they need to change. And yeah. Does it make sense?
Yes, Miss. Thank you.
Thanks, Bagus.
Okay, thank you for the question and the answer from Miss Elske. Next, for the next question is come from Alifian Cahyo. For Alifian.
Yes, excuse me. My name is Alifian. In the PowerPoint, you said that media can be used to communicate the development. Then how to use the media effectively in order to use it as a way to communicate the development when people are not really interested in it. Thank you.
Okay, good. So thanks, that's good. So what I also said in that slide is that media, often have a role for awareness raising rather than really providing deep knowledge or skills development. A little bit of knowledge you can get, but it's very much awareness raising. So it's people might get curious about something. So, and then you have to think about how can I people, and that's what you do as a communication or as a media person, how can you use that media to make people more curious? Now, what we know, for instance, when we talk about farmers usually only trust other farmers, right? So rather than getting a young, recently graduated extension officer who has no farming experience on camera and tell what is the great technology, a much better strategy is to get another farmer who has that experience, on camera and have them tell what is good and what is difficult, and have them give that more practice-based experience. So that's how you can use the media rather than giving a lecture by a professor or by an extension officer. And so that's how you can use the media, but in a more in a way that it appeals to the audience. So of course, rule 101 of communication is always think about your audience first. Who are they? What do they know? What language do they speak? For instance, in Vietnam, when I worked there with the ethnic minority communities in the mountains. So they started, the moment they had electricity and they had a little bit of money, they would buy these parabola discs. And I've seen them like in the south of Malang, like 20 years ago or something, very poor area, but almost every small, simple house, rumah gedek, they would still have a parabola disc to get the private television channels, right? And from some family members who work overseas, they send money and they buy that. For entertainment or whatever. So the government in Vietnam, they say, oh, people now have television. So they would start making television programs on the local, on the government channels. But the government channels are distributed on through different systems that you need, the free TV systems that you need an antenna, right? And not on the private satellite channels. So the government was broadcasting to an audience that wasn't even watching because they didn't have the antennas and weren't the kind of tuning into the government channels. And it's only because they weren't first talking to people, say, hey, where do you get your information from? Right? So you'd really have to think about your audience. What kind of information do they need? In what language do they need it? Both ethnic language as well as like technical language. Very often our language is far too complicated. And then also what channels are suitable. And again, there's no one size fits all. If there's one thing you want to remember from this lecture, and I'll remember that one, no one size fits all, right? Yeah. Does it answer your question, Alifian?
No, thank you for the answers. It really explained a lot.
Okay, thank you for Alifian. Okay, anyone want to ask a question to Miss Elster about our topic today? So Miss Elster, if I want to ask a question, is it okay?
Sure, of course.
Okay, so it is really interesting for me to see your presentation about the how the communication can have a role in the social change. So now we face the digital era, as you say in your presentation, that now we face the digital era, but somehow in Indonesia, when we come to this digital era, we have an obstacle about the agriculture, that is less of the young generation have the attraction to the agriculture right now. So I want to ask how communication can have an important role to change this situation or this condition, so that can be more or a lot of young generation will be more attracted, have a good attraction or attractive to the agriculture in Indonesia. Thank you.
Yeah. So what I've seen is that there are, of course, there are always going to be now young people out of education that that don't want to work as a farmer, or going to go to agriculture. And, some areas are just really bloody hard, so I have a project in Timor-Leste, and, the average farmer is probably 50 years old, because young people all go to the city, but it is so hard. It's dry, it's rocky, it's, it's hot, so it's not necessarily something you would do. Where I've seen young people jumping back into agriculture, even with education, even with bachelor's degrees, is where there was actually opportunities for more profitable, not just for the subsistence, but go into cattle production, where you can really, do cattle fattening and have this turnover every 3 to 6 months. You can sell something and you get actually quite a chunk of money. Or the fancier crops, but like cabe or bawang merah, but there's also a lot of risk involved with those. And so in a way, so what young people who've grown up in this different era, where they have a lot of access to information, but also want things that maybe their parents did not necessarily want, like, the latest model of smartphone or internet access, and what is that you'd really have to work on those critical skills to work out what agriculture enterprise is actually going to give you money, how to do that economic analysis in a way that you can manage. So it would be much more into becoming rather than just a farm laborer, or just doing the hard work, in like becoming a manager. And that's what you see in Western countries. Here in Australia, there's huge areas of farming. It's a huge economy, but there's very few people who are farmers. Same in the Netherlands, where I'm from, because it's more intensive systems. But young people need to have good knowledge, and often have a university degree, to be able to be managers of this farm, and and get into. So and that's why I said, with people who've always done it the traditional way, you can't graduate them straight from TK to S3, right? But if you're already at another level and you have some education and you're interested in that, then you can already work at a different level and get different agriculture systems. But again, there's no one size fits all. So one thing we try to do in Timor-Leste at some stage, and using communication means, is actually getting a group of young people who came from rural villages, but were living in Dili, in the capital city, basically, doing some chores for the uncles who would just give them food and a bed to sleep on, and maybe selling a little bit of, phone pulsa, but not having any opportunities to really, earn an income. So, but they also didn't want to go back, they didn't want to become farmers. So one method that we used is actually have them make a film, so engage them in making a film about their life story, about kind of, what does life look like here in the city? What are the good things? What are the bad things? And then what does life look like, when you go back to the village? What are the opportunities? So that second phase we still have to do, now that we have better cattle management systems in Timor that are more attractive to young people. And that's that process, what we often call it conscientization. So it is bukan hanya menyadarkan, tapi menyadarkan secara dalam-dalam, ya, orang betul-betul itu mengerti peluangnya yang ada bagi dia, masalah yang ada bagi dia, dan peluangnya untuk mengubah dan memperbaiki kehidupannya. So, and you can use those, storytelling, a video, like making participatory video or visual storytelling, in helping people to understand their options better and then make better decisions.
Thank you for Ms. Eske for the answer. It's a really great answer. Okay, so now, any question for the others? Maybe Mr. Media or Bu Fiin?
I want to ask the question, Bu Laili. Okay. Bu Elske, interest about your material today, and one of the other side of the economic growth is lost culture. Yes. Can you give your opinion about what the strategy to overcome this impact?
To what? Sorry, say that again.
What the strategy to overcome this impact to lost culture about the lost culture?
Yeah. It is. I mean, once it's lost, it's lost. Well, maybe not. It can be revived. It is really a participatory approach. You know, it is about sitting with people who the change process is meant for, and have to determine what is important in their lives. If that is, you know, if we have great technical solutions, but they go against some traditional methods, you know, or methods or religious beliefs, then it's not going to work, right? So you have to discuss that together. Yeah, I mean, so
difficult maybe.
It's very difficult, and that's why
yes,
these participatory processes are really good, but they're really difficult to do, and they take more time. But eventually, they will have more impact and longer lasting impact. So the problem is with many projects in Indonesia, they're too short. If you only have 1 year to do things, or less than a year, you cannot really get that whole level of ownership transferred, and, you know, and have people actually start doing things because they understand what needs to be done. So you need to have a somewhat, you know, longer term engagement before things really will take off by themselves. Timor-Leste project, it took us 4 years for farmers to really understand the importance. So what we're doing there is, it is about actually improving cattle production. Cattle is just roaming in the mountains, mainly for mas kawin, right? Petani butuh banyak ekor atau banyak kepala, tapi nggak banyak daging kan. Yang penting ini anaknya dikawinkan ini sekian ekor. Kurus atau gemuk nggak apa-apa.
Urusannya belakangan.
Nah, tapi kan kalau dia ternaknya untuk sebagai sumber pendapatan, kan mau dijual ke pasar untuk daging, kan, dan orang di kota kan semua sekarang mau makan daging sapi, kan harus gemuk. Cara memelihara itu beda. Berarti kita merencanakan, bukan hanya memberitahu kepada petani, karena nggak mungkin dia langsung bisa melakukan semua proses untuk penggemukan, karena harus diikat, harus menanam pakan atau dikumpul. Banyak sekali langkah. Akhirnya kita membentuk suatu disebut, kita sebut ready commodity, itu apa bahasa Indonesia? Karawa Morisdiek, artinya Cattle for Better Livelihoods, and its network.
For better livelihood.
Kelompok, semacam kelompok penelitian untuk, tapi petani yang melakukan uji coba sendiri bersama petugas penyuluh, petugas teknis, sama juga pedagang, dan mereka bersama-sama belajar apa yang perlu diketahui dari opsi-opsi yang ada dari penelitian, apa yang bisa kerja bagi mereka, dari segi menanam pakan atau dari segi cara memelihara sapi, tapi dia harus menentukan sendiri. Baru setelah 4 tahun ini mereka giat sekali, karena dia baru melihat. Karena awalnya dia tanya, oh kenapa nggak dikasih sapi dari pemerintah, atau kenapa nggak dikasih pakan, minta-minta, karena udah biasa dari program kan akan diberi bantuan, padahal tidak ada perubahan. Sekian banyak bantuan nggak pernah ada perubahan, karena petani tergantung pada bantuan. Nah, dia memiliki proses perubahan. Berarti dengan proses membentuk kelompok yang akan memecahkan masalah sendiri di lingkungan, baru dia mau giat dia lagi. Caranya begitu ya. Tapi ya, it takes very long time, particularly to break through those traditions of cuma minta-minta saja. Tapi tidak
di bawah. Ini Indonesia.
Ya sama aja. Tapi sebenarnya ada, ini mungkin pernah dengan sekolah lapang ya, sekolah lapangan
SL.
Ya, SLPT atau SLPTT. Ini prinsip sama dulu ya. Saya dulu penelitian S3 saya tentang SLPT padi. Prinsipnya memang petani belajar melalui pengalaman dan uji coba. Tapi kadang juga menjadi tetap demplot aja di mana diberi bantuan dari program-program kan itu, karena sering dari dinas terlalu repot kalau harus bertemu tiap minggu harus ini. Tapi itu bukan, karena kita jangan hanya melihat hasil, yang harus dilihat proses perubahan pada kemampuan si petani untuk betul-betul memiliki proses perubahan itu.
Skill, yes.
skill and develop the
Okay.
critical
Yeah,
skills, so they
develop a
they can
skill.
work out for themselves that what is better for them, rather than diberitahu sama penyuluhnya atau peneliti.
Okay, thank you, Bu Aska. Nice answer.
Okay, thank you for Bu Viin. So we can highlight that the most important thing is the process, not just for hasilnya aja, but the process is also important. And maybe any question from Mr. Media?
Wis kesel kabeh.
Okay. Maybe I last question.
Okay, maybe the
I
last
have
question
a
for Mr. Media.
question.
Okay.
I asked to Bu Elske, Dr. Elske. I interest about farmer is included in farmer group. Maybe any the risk for farmer is not included in farmer group because usually program bantuan program or subsidi usually transfer and distribution financial to farmer group. What for the farmer is not included in farmer group? Okay, maybe this is my question. Yeah.
So you're talking about farmer groups, the typical kelompok tani di Indonesia, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Nah, kalau saya, I've always found the way the kelompok tani are managed in Indonesia quite problematic, and the system they are, the way they use the farmer groups to get programs implemented. So kelompok tani kan ditentukan perhamparan, kan? So it's not necessarily that they have similar interests, but it's just they are there in the same area. And then they have to have something, they've got something like 12 or 12 books, administrasi, kan? harus ada buku tamu, ada buku keuangan, buku ini, buku itu. Kan, dan yang dilihat untuk efisiensi kelompok tani oleh dinas cuma penyelesaian buku-buku itu, bukan hasil di lapangan atau mutu proses kalau misalnya dialog di antara anggota kelompok. So it's very mechanical on the administration of the farmer groups. And it often comes down to a farmer group leader who's good at filling out the books. And they are the ones who get the projects, right? If they are already tingkat berapa, they get more projects, because they're more advanced farmer groups, but it's not necessarily the ones who need it or who the project is suitable for. And so it's a total disconnect of needs and apa dari kebutuhan, peluang dan proses yang dilakukan. But it's just the easiest. It's the way the dinas is doing it, because they are, and very often it's because Pak PPL punya ini yang ketua kelompok tani pamannya atau siapa kan, karena udah kenal sering ke sana terus mereka jadi lebih maju, tapi ya belum tentu itu dia yang membutuhkan suatu perubahan. Berarti so it's the whole system that, and we try to change that with the farmer field schools. And that it is really about people who want to learn new things and want to implement things, but it was very difficult to integrate that as a kind of a structure. So it's more like it was always a project. Farmer field schools have always been project, whereas the whole intention of farmer field school program in the 1990s was to change the structure of the extension system, but that has never happened because it's too complicated to change the system. Ya, berarti saya masih tetap mikir ini kan perlu dilihat. Sering kalau saya kerja dengan kelompok, saya nggak terlalu peduli dengan struktur kelompok tani bagaimana. Yang penting ada orang yang mau gerak, yang mau menjadi terlibat dalam proses penyadaran apa peluangnya, apa kebutuhannya dan lain sebagainya, mau belajar. Dan nanti kalau dia sudah memiliki dan dia sudah sadar, dia pasti akan mengundang orang lain. Dan secara organik, ya, secara otomatis di suatu masyarakat akan berubah. Tapi orang yang nggak mau berubah ya tidak akan berubah. Dan kita nggak perlu dipaksa. Saya selalu bilang sama orang, kalau hanya mau datang ke sini minta, tapi kenapa saya mau datang habiskan waktu untuk orang yang nggak mau berubah sendiri? Kan percuma. Ini seperti kejam, tapi sebenarnya itu untuk menambahkan kesadaran mereka ya bagaimana kalau perubahan hanya bisa dari hati nuraninya dan upayanya sendiri. Dan justru sistem penyuluhan harus memfasilitasi proses itu. Sorry, does it make sense?
Okay, enough. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you for Mr. Media. So that is all of the question from the participants, including the student and the lecturers. So how about Miss Elske? Is it okay to us to close our guest lecture for this session?
Absolutely. Yeah.
The
So,
second session.
yeah,
Okay.
we've got another session to go. So,
okay. So it is really great and interesting presentation for Miss Elske, and it is really great opportunity for all of you students to have more information and knowledge about the social change and communication. And great, thank you everyone. We appreciate you being here. We do hope that this guest lecture will be first step to the future collaboration between University of Brawijaya and Queensland University. And we would like to say that thank you to our guest lecturer, that is Miss Elske. Today we worked hard for make this event ready, and of course the participant who has participated in this guest lecture, even it is already afternoon and maybe you don't have your lunch, but it's okay, you're already doing great. And we will see you next time. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good afternoon for everyone.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi
Waalaikumsalam
wabarakatuh.
warahmatullahi
Waalaikumsalam
wabarakatuh.
warahmatullahi
thank you.
wabarakatuh. Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Miss Elske, we move to the second section at